Taking a 2D concept all the way over to a finished 3D character can be one of the more complex tasks that you can do if you're new to the world of 3D. With so many technical terms and different packages that do similar tasks, it can be real easy for a beginner to get lost along the way. In this video, I'm going to be breaking down step by step my own 3D character creation pipeline and hopefully bring clarity if you have been struggling with the 3D modeling, the texturing, or the rendering of your 3D characters. So stay tuned for my 3D character creation tutorial for beginners in the video coming up. What's going on, you 3D modeling beast? This is JL Musey, and welcome to my 3D character creation tutorial for beginners. And in this video, I'm going to be sharing step by step my 3D character creation process. I'm going to quickly break down each step of the tutorial so you have a better idea moving forward what this tutorial is about. So first, I'll start with pre-production. Pre-production is basically just the concept art that you may receive from another artist, or maybe your own reference sheets that you create. Next, we'll move on to the modeling part, and this is where we'll spend a bulk of the time because there are definitely a lot of different options for creating your meshes, right? Whether you choose to sculpt first, or you choose more to do a traditional route with modeling and then do sculpting on top of that, you have a lot of choices, and I'm going to break down each of the ones available to you. Parallel to modeling, I'm going to be covering cloth creation and hair creation, and both of these can actually be modeled, or they can be actually simulated or created an alternate way, and I'll explain the differences between both. Moving on, we'll take a look at texturing, and this is where things start to come alive. You start adding materials, you start adding colors, and I'm going to go ahead and share my techniques for creating realistic or stylized textures and really just making them fit within the realm of your character. Moving along, we'll cover posing, which brings in rigging and some animation into the mix, but it's definitely important for you to be able to pose your characters, especially for presentation purposes. From there, we'll move on to shading and lighting, where you're adding materials and lights, you're pulling all your texture maps in, and you're really just preparing everything for the final phase. And finally, it's rendering, where you set up your scene and you hit the render button, and the render engine of your choice is going to calculate everything that you put in front of it, and it's going to spit out images. And it's up to you whether that image is your final, or if you want to do final tweaking on that or further tweaking on that, you can go ahead and export out layers and composite it in a package like Photoshop to even have more control of your final image. So we're going to be covering all those things. So without further ado, let's get on with the video. Pre-production. So pre-production is the initial design phase of your character before it actually is to be modeled and fleshed out as a 3D character. This process does have various routes that you can go about it. A lot of people think that it could just be concept art, but there's actually a multitude of ways in which you could do pre-production, okay? The first one would be concept art, and concept art is just a 2D illustration. Now, not all concept art is built the same. So if you get concept art from an illustrator that is not really a seasoned concept artist, then him or she was basically creating that piece of art for creating a piece of art, and the intent was not to create a fully finished 3D character. So you, as a modeler, you're going to have to do more translation work, because that reference, right, might not match exactly into a fully realized 3D object. Versus if you had somebody that actually does concept art more often, they're going to be able to create a 2D illustration, but they're actually going to make these drawings actually with a 3D design in mind that fits in a real physical world. We can then move on to sculpting, right? So since the emergence of packages like Zbrush, Blender has sculpting. So anytime that you can get in and you can subdivide a mesh, it's a lot easier to push and pull and really get a good idea before you start modeling of the final look of your character. And I actually prefer this a lot of just going into Zbrush and creating a rough sculpt, and that way I can take that rough sculpt and take it into a package like Maya, clean it up, and do my base form from there. Also want to talk about reference sheets. I used to do these in Photoshop, but now I switched over to a package called PureRef. And basically what a reference sheet is, it's really just all these different images that are going to be used for reference and inspiration, and usually it's laid out as one big image where you can go in there, and I usually use reference sheets in conjunction with a 2D concept. So I like to think about pre-production on a sliding scale. So the more thought on the concept art that artist put, the more experience that he has creating 2D illustrations or sketches that are meant to be translated, and he put the time, work, has the experience to know what's going to translate well, and has explored all these options already, design options, then that means the less that I'm going to have to explore design options, or the less that I'm going to have to make sure on my end that it actually translate into a finished 3D modeling. So I like to split modeling into two realms or two techniques. The first is poly modeling. Poly modeling might seem more like an outdated technique, and this is where you basically just stick your concept or your blueprints into a viewport. So maybe like a package like Maya, Blender, Moto, where you're just basically taking some references and modeling on top of that with polygons, hence the name. But I like to just think about this as how much exploration do I have to do, right? So this is how I evaluate if poly modeling is going to work well for me. So for hard surface, it's very easy for me to create hard surface elements in Maya because I know exactly what they're going to look like, and I don't have to explore a lot of shapes. But if my concept art is relatively light, or maybe it's illustration or relatively loose, then I will actually go into sculpting versus a poly modeling for the start of my project. So I do my sculpting in Zbrush, and I like to just explore the shapes and see if I can start to translate that 2D concept into a design, a 3D design that actually works well, right? So from sculpting, there's different avenues that you can start, right? You can start with a sphere, but you could also start with a base mesh, right? So sometimes it's easier to bring in a base mesh. Say I'm doing a human character, instead of starting with a sphere, I will start with a base mesh because that base mesh already has the topology of a face, right? Of a human face, of a human head. I have all my loops in place. So even though each of the heads is gonna differ a little bit, it's not gonna differ that much, right? Because the reality is human heads, for the most part, stick to a similar realm of proportions. So that means that I can sculpt, I can push and pull, but at the end of the day, I already have my topology in place, right? So from sculpting, if you are doing the concepting phase, I want to talk about decimation. And maybe you've heard this term before, but maybe you have a real loose concept that is comprised of millions of polygons. And unless you're doing the retopology process in a package like Zbrush and you need to export that, well, Zbrush is very good at handling a very high polygon count. But maybe if you take that into Blender or Maya, that's not going to fly as well. So what decimation actually does, it reduces the poly count of your mesh, but keeps the actual shape and silhouette and details intact. So it's a way of preserving the overall shape, reducing the poly count, that allows you to take it into a package like Maya so you could do your retopology. So what is retopology? Well, retopology is basically redrawing your topology, right? So you have a loose concept, a loose sketch, right? That's done in 3D, just really a mush of digital clay that needs to be cleaned up for production purposes, right? And these steps are not necessary if you actually don't care about having a production mesh, right? So if you're just doing a pretty concept piece, you can't actually do everything within ZBrush. So you can sculpt, you can poly paint, and you can render in a package like ZBrush. But if it needs to be animated or moved, then you will need to actually do retopology, and most likely you will need UVs as well. Cloth. So I put cloth next to modeling or parallel to modeling because cloth can be modeled, it can be sculpted. And I have done that in the past where I have tried to sculpt cloth, and at first I've seen artists do it within ZBrush, and I was inspired, and I said, you know what, I'm gonna work really hard to get good at this. But I figured this is really hard. And it's hard because cloth has a lot of moving elements, right? So upon learning more about cloth, the rabbit hole goes pretty deep. So I learned that cloth actually has a different type of folds, pipe folds, Z folds, right? A lot of different moving pieces. So different types of fabrics create different types of folds, right? So maybe if you have a jean fabric, it's going to be completely different than maybe a sweater or a cotton-based t-shirt, right? So there's a lot of moving components, and it's not to say that you cannot sculpt great wrinkles in great cloth, because there is artists that actually have done it. But I think consensus-wise, or the majority, it's really hard, and I see a lot of artists struggle with cloth more really than anything else. So I see a lot of great anatomy, a lot of good hair, but when it comes to the cloth and artists trying to do it by hand, I see that it could be a lot of weak points. And it was a weak point for my characters for a long time. I put the time in, I studied the anatomy, and I got mixed results, right? And then I heard about this package called Marvelous Designer. And Marvelous Designer is a package that initially was intended for fashion designers to just come up with different styles or different garments and just simulate it in 3D. Eventually 3D artists got a wind of that, and they started using them for their own characters, for their own pipeline. So I tried it, and I got excellent results. Now you don't have to go in a Marvelous Designer. You could actually sim cloth in Ncloth and Maya, or your 3D package might have a cloth sim of their own that you can experiment with. But Marvelous, I got better results in my opinion than Ncloth. So I liked it, I used it, and it gave me a really good base mesh to actually then take into ZBrush and apply those fine wrinkles. So that was my pipeline. Now, the one thing about Marvelous is that it's not so hard to actually learn the package, but the true challenge comes from getting good topology and getting a clean base mesh, right? And I'm not gonna dive into that process because it is a little bit more complex that I want to talk about in the scope of this video, but it is a little bit of a process to getting a clean mesh from Marvelous, or just a clean retopo. So that was my experience with Marvelous, and the results came out really good. The base mesh came out really good, and once I had the base mesh, those smaller details were easier to sculpt in ZBrush because I already had the major landmarks of the shape of the folds of the cloth. Environment. So why am I talking about environment in a character creation video? And that's because, and this is just my personal opinion as an artist, but recently I have started to create pedestals for my characters. And if you see these character pedestals right here, you see that over time they get more evolved, right? So for this RoboCop scene, it was a pretty generic one. Then I moved on to this apocalypse one here, where it was a little bit more involved. And for my latest character, the mechanic, I even pushed that further, right? And this might come from a little bit of my background as 3D printing. I also do like to collect collectible statues, but I noticed that collectible statues look really good on a pedestal, right? And I think that it serves, if you create a character pedestal, I think it serves or helps tell that character's story, right? And that's why my pedestals have actually gotten more detailed. I've done more texture work over time because I want to tell a better story about that character. Hair. And this is on the same plane as modeling, because modeling, it is an option to create hair, right? And really depending on your final output, your final look, sculpting might or might not be an option. So if you want super realistic hair, most likely modeling or even doing hair cards won't be an option, and you'd have to go into a grooming solution. So let's talk about the modeling first. And for this character, the mechanic, I chose to model a good base mesh. Then I took it into Zbrush and sculpted the details on top. So the modeling process was relatively straightforward. I just used curves, and from those curves I will loft between them and then model out the base mesh, which then was taken into Zbrush to sculpt on added details. And modeling does work well for stylized characters. The other option, which still is closer to the realm of modeling, is doing hair cards. Hair cards are popular in video game characters, and hair cards are pretty much how they sound like. They are planes or shaped planes, and then you use a alpha map as a transparency to actually chop into the planes and create the actual strands and fibers, right? So it's just really basic modeling and an alpha, and really it's more of a texturing trick than real hair. And the last solution, and if you wanted something more realistic, is grooming. So Maya has XGen, Zbrush has fiber mesh, and different packages have different grooming solutions. Essentially, grooming is where you take hair guides, and for those guides you actually use to style or groom the different hairstyles that you want, and through the render settings you could allocate more hair strands or more density to those guides that you are creating. And this will give you a pretty realistic result if you do things properly. Texturing. So texturing is the process of applying a color information or color maps to your model. And texturing does technically go beyond just color information like height, roughness, metalness, so it does actually encompass way more than color. So what do you need in order to apply a texture to your model? Well, the first part is you actually need UVs, right? UVs are coordinates that 3D models need in order to wrap a 2D image, which is essentially what a texture is, onto a 3D model. And the process of UVing has come a long ways, and now most packages support unfold operations, where really on the model you select the seam lines that you need, unwrap the model, you will be able to see how much distortion you are having. So if you've ever seen models with the checkerboard or a checkerboard like pattern, is actually to check for distortion as you're doing the process of UVs before you actually get to texture and apply texture that otherwise will be distorted due to distortion within that UV layout. So once you have your character nice unfolded and those UV shells looking correctly, you can move on to the actual texturing process. Back in the days, Photoshop was a tool for this, and Photoshop is still used, but now a lot of artists actually choose to go with packages like Substance Painter or even Mari to actually create their maps. And the good thing about doing it in 3D is that you are applying it right on the mesh. It makes things like dealing with seams not so much of a headache, and you get instant feedback on how those texture changes are being applied to your 3D model. The last part of the texturing process would actually be baking of the maps. In baking of the maps, so I work in Substance, is basically just exporting all my maps out and getting them ready for my final render engine, and the different maps will plug into different parameters within my shader. And this is where I get to decide the resolution of the maps, samples, the actual anti-aliasing, the details of the map. So all these things have to be decided before you export/bake your maps. Posing. This is something that I took granted for a long time, And I think a lot of students or beginners do this where they will submit a character in an A pose or a T pose. And while it makes sense for a production process for the character to be in such poses, presentation wise, it's actually a very weak way of presenting a character, and it really takes all the life away from a character. So the first one is rigging, right? And rigging is its own discipline, and I'm talking about rigging for animation. Luckily for modelers, rigging for just posing is actually a little bit simpler of a process. So I use the auto rig feature within Maya, where it allows me to place some guides within my model, and then from those guides I can create bones, even add custom bones relatively easy, and then bind those bones to the mesh, which is called skinning. So using the quick rig will give me a quick dirty rig with actual FK IK controls, which are controls that make it easier to pose. And I will pose the character, and then if I need to adjust weights, I'll either use the component editor or the paint weights tool to do some quick dirty weights. And from the quick dirty weights, I can go ahead and export that model and go into Zbrush and really just fine tweak or sculpt on top of that, and really just blend out any imperfections or even add muscle deformations to my characters. Another thing that I've actually done too is use grouping and pivot points, which is almost like building a bone hierarchy, but you would do it with groups within a package like Maya. And I actually did this for moving the hands of this mechanic character. And the last way to pose is if you're in ZBrush, you could actually do this in a sculpting fashion, right? So you can mask different parts of your model, and you can use the transpose tool to actually bend those limbs. And I have done this also when creating characters and really just concepting poses as well. Shading and lighting. So let's go ahead and start with materials. Different materials are going to have different properties, and those properties are going to go ahead and reflect what that material should look like in the real world, right? So something that is metal is going to have metal properties, is going to have specularity properties that are probably a lot different than a skin material, which is going to have specularity and maybe subsurface scattering and different parameters in order for that material to behave differently. Moving on is lights. And lights and lighting is actually an art form in itself, and I didn't really understand this until later. But lighting, just besides the fact of just placing lights and hitting a render, it's also the setup, and a lot of thought has to go into the setup of your lighting in order for it to be effective and in order to convey the right mood for your character. And the other things that a light actually helps to do is make your character pop from your background. So one of the most important things about lighting is that it should do justice to your model. So if you spend a lot of time creating this beautiful model, this beautiful texture setup, but the lights don't do it justice, you're really just throwing away a lot of the work that you did, right? Along with standard lights, you want to look at things like HDRs, which are high dynamic range images. And this is one of the things, especially for things that are shiny or reflective, that is very important. So when I first started doing characters, I did a lot of hard surface characters, a lot of reflective materials, but I didn't have an image in the background. So what ended up happening is you have a highly reflective material with nothing bouncing of it, right? So no color information, no actual environment to reflect onto those surfaces. And ultimately, if you step back, that really looks really fake, because in real life, we don't have a studio setup for most things, right? So if we put a soda can in the outside in a hot, shiny day, it's going to reflect part of that environment, right? If we take a picture of our car and it's reflective, in which most car paint should be, it's going to reflect some of that environment. So that's really what kills a lot of the realism in some renders when students are just starting out is they put in just standard lights without having any HDRs, any image information bouncing off those reflected surfaces. Rendering. This is where everything comes together, and your renderer of choice will actually compute all the information or all of the scene that you have laid out in front of it, right? So things like your lights, your textures, your geometry, everything comes together, and a lot of the final render quality is depending on your render settings, right? So the level of anti-aliasing, how many samples you set up, subsurface scattering for your skin, if you have global illumination or not, the quality of your shadows. So you really want to look at rendering as a cost-benefit scenario. You really want to understand what each setting does, and your cost for higher settings is more time. Now the caveat to this is that sometimes some higher render settings don't really do a great deal of improvement over your render, but can exponentially increase render times. So that's why it's just a good practice to actually know what actually is changing within your scene as you up certain settings and what is really not doing anything at all. There's also different render engines, and there's also different dedicated render software. So for example, Maya, you can get RenderMan, you could also get Arnold, you could also get Redshift, or you could also get V-Ray and a multiple of other renderers, and those are just loaded up like a plugin. But there are dedicated softwares like Keyshot, and you could even do real-time rendering in a package called Toolbag, and that's a package that I've actually been using more over Arnold, just due to the fact that to me it's a little bit easier to get a one-to-one correlation and just overall setup with the textures that I do within Substance Painter. Conclusion: character modeling is one of the more challenging things that you can do as a beginner. So if you know my channel, you know that I do a lot of hard surface modeling videos, a lot of hard surface models. And once I learned hard surface modeling, like once I learned how to do a car, I felt confident that I could do the next car, right? Or that I could do anything really just hard surface related with ease. But with character modeling, it's something that I'm always learning something new to do, right? And I think that's where a lot of beginners basically get in trouble, because they go right out the gate. They want to do a very complex character with very different moving pieces and assets, right? So they want to do the muscular guy with the jacket, with the jeans, and he's flexing, he's in a pose, he has long hair flowing, and that's what they shoot for, that's what they get the reference. And when they start the process, they're like, wait, I have to figure out how to do hair, I have to figure out how to do cloth, I have to figure out how to pose this character. So my advice is that start out small. Maybe you could focus on anatomy and posing and do that and get a couple of bad models out of the way. And I say that because most modelers, me included, or any character artists that you do follow, their first models probably weren't that great, right? And over time, they get enough bad models, they get enough practice, and they improve slowly over time, right? So you're not gonna nail your first character model right out the gate, especially if it's a very complex one with layered assets and effects and complexity, right? So start out small, and then maybe once you figure out the anatomy, the posing, okay, I want to add some good pore details. So you start researching that, and now you get good pore details. I want to get better at expressions or even blend shapes, right? So you focus on that, and then maybe you can go ahead and add a more complex hairstyle where you're grooming, and then finally you can go ahead and start adding clothes. You could start simming, and you could really just work incrementally towards a more believable yet complex character.